Hello, welcome to Dr. Solomon Vid. This is our second episode of the Special Senses, specifically the vision. In today's discussion, we are going to look at the fissures and foramen within the bony orbit. The bony orbit is a skeletal structure which is located on either side of the root of the nose. It houses the eyeball and the associated structures. There are so many fissures and foramina within the bony orbit. But in the first place, we are first going to recap the boundaries of the bony orbit. The bony orbit in its shape, it's quadrangular in shape, and it assumes the pyramidal shape. It has the base anteriorly at the opening of the eye, and it narrows posteromedially towards the apex. As it can be seen from this picture, there are so many bones that makes up the bony orbit. We have the frontal bone, maxillary bone, zygomatic bone, ethmoid bone, lacrimal bone, nasal bone, greater wing of sphenoid bone, lesser wing of sphenoid bone, and palatine bones. These bones make up different boundaries of the bony orbit. The frontal bone, especially the orbital plate of the frontal bone, makes up the roof of the bony orbit, together with the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. These two bones gives the contribution to the roof of the bony orbit. The floor of the bony orbit majorly is contributed by the orbital plate of the maxillary bone. We have the maxilla here, and the orbital plate of the maxillary bone contribute to the floor of the bony orbit. We also have some other contributions from the palatine bone and zygomatic bone. These three combination makes up the floor of the bony orbit. Then we have the medial wall. The medial wall is contributed by the ethmoid bone, the nasal bone, the lacrimal bone, with some contribution of the orbital plate of the frontal bone. The lateral boundary majorly is contributed by the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone. We have the zygomatic bone because this is a very big bone, and it gives a lateral wall of the bony orbit, together with some little contribution from the greater wing of sphenoid bone. Now, within these boundaries, there are important structures that enters and exit through these bony structures. And these structures include the nerves, the blood vessels, arteries, and veins that either exits or enters through these bony structures. Within the roof, we find the most important structure within the roof, the foramen. We have superior supraorbital groove. We have supraorbital groove at this particular point. Supraorbital groove is located at the margin, orbital margin of the frontal bone. And it is a very important structure as it acts as the exit point of supraorbital nerves and supraorbital vessels. Okay? So, at this particular point, we have supraorbital groove. At this groove, we find the vessels and then the nerves, the supraorbital vessels and then the supraorbital nerves. And then another important feature within the roof of the bony orbit, we have a very important fossa at this particular point, especially at the superlateral margin of the orbit. This is lacrimal fossa. Lacrimal fossa is a place that houses the lacrimal sac. The lacrimal sac and the nasolacrimal apparatus, we shall talk about it in the upcoming discussion. Those are the two major important features within the roof of the bony orbit. When we look at the floor of the bony orbit, as I told you earlier on, the floor is majorly contributed by the maxilla, the orbital plate of the maxillary bone, and with some other contributions from the zygomatic and then the palatine bone. There is a very, very, very important structure within the floor of the bony orbit. That is inferior orbital fissure. Okay, inferior orbital fissure. Let me make it red. We have inferior orbital fissure. Now, the inferior orbital fissure is located between the greater wing of the sphenoid and then the maxillary bone. It acts as the exit point for the divisions of the trigeminal nerve. Especially, there are several divisions of trigeminal nerve, especially the part of the maxillary nerve. And the specific division of the maxillary nerve is infraorbital nerve, which is the division of the maxillary nerve of trigeminal nerve. That is cranial nerve number 5. Then, another important structure that it is contained within this structure is the branch of the inferior ophthalmic vein. And then we have several other divisions of the emissary vein that enter through this structure. And most importantly, we also have the sympathetic nerves that exit through this structure. So, this inferior orbital fissure is a very, very important structure because of the structures that exit and then enter through that particular point. Okay? Another structure within the floor of the bony orbit is the infraorbital foramen. Okay, infraorbital foramen. This is the exit point. We find that the infraorbital structures, we have the infraorbital nerve coming out through this particular point. We have the infraorbital nerve and then the infraorbital blood vessels, the veins and then the arteries. That enters and then comes out of this particular structure. Those are the foramina and then the fissures that are within the floor of the bony orbit. Now, when we look at the medial wall of the bony orbit, we have the ethmoid bone, the nasal bone, and then the lacrimal bone. Okay? Now, the fissures and then the foramen that can be found here we have, there's a very important structure that passes within this lacrimal bone here. We have lacrimal canal. We have the opening for lacrimal canal. This is where the lacrimal duct and then other lacrimal, especially as lacrimal duct passes from this particular point. Okay? So another important structure on the medial wall, we have the anterior ethmoidal foramen and posterior ethmoidal foramen. Anterior ethmoidal foramen and posterior ethmoidal foramen. Okay? So anterior ethmoidal foramen, this is where the anterior ethmoidal nerves exits. And also the posterior ethmoidal foramen, this is anterior ethmoidal foramen. And this is posterior ethmoidal foramen. This is for the exit of anterior ethmoidal nerve, and posterior ethmoidal foramen is for the exit of posterior ethmoidal nerve. So those are the only structures that can be found within the medial wall. I told you about the lacrimal canal for the nasolacrimal duct. Anterior ethmoidal foramen for the anterior ethmoidal nerve, and then posterior ethmoidal foramen for the posterior ethmoidal nerve. Okay? Lastly, we have the lateral wall. The lateral wall, we have two foramen. We have zygomaticofacial foramen. We have zygomaticofacial foramen. Zygomaticofacial foramen is for the zygomaticofacial nerve. This is where the zygomaticofacial nerve exits. And then we have zygomaticotemporal foramen. Zygomaticotemporal foramen. Zygomaticotemporal foramen is where the zygomaticotemporal nerve exit, okay? And lastly, the apex. Within the apex of the bony orbit, we have the most important structure, that is optic canal. We find the optic canal. Canal is located within the apex of the bony orbit, okay? Now, in optic canal, majorly we find it is two structures. That is optic nerve and ophthalmic artery, okay? So you can see the importance of these fissures and foramina because they are the structures where the other structures exits or enters the bony orbit, okay? And clinically, in case of maybe hematoma or any swelling within the bony orbit, these structures can be compressed and then also can impair the functioning of, the other structures whereby those structures passing through the foramina supply. And then also maybe in case of the fractures within this bony orbit can cause injury not only to the eye, but also to these structures that exit, okay? So it is important to keep, especially the region of the eye safe from fractures and then maybe any kind of injuries, because we are not only protecting the eye or the structure for vision, but we are also protecting these other structures that exist and then enter through the bony orbit. Thank you so much.